In this video, we're going to look at verbs. So, what are verbs? Well, verbs are one of the 9 parts of speech, and here they are in alphabetical order. The one we're looking at today is verbs. Before we look at a definition for verb, it's worth saying that verbs are a very important part of speech. You cannot write a sentence without a verb. So here are some sentences. These are all about Venus. And you can see that there is a verb in every sentence. You cannot write a sentence without a verb. Okay, now we know how important verbs are. Let's look at a definition. Verbs express physical actions, mental actions, or states of being. So that's physical actions, mental actions, or states of being. Well, let's look at each one in turn. Let's start with physical actions. Dance is a verb. Jump is a verb. Wash is a verb. When you're naming verbs, it's quite normal to put a to in front. This makes it clear that it's the infinitive version. This just means it's the version you would find in a dictionary. So we might say to dance, to jump, to wash. Okay, so these are obviously physical actions. Let's look at mental actions next. To think, to guess, to consider. For example, to consider something funny. So these are mental actions. Here the activity is going on inside the head. So that's a fairly easy concept. But look at this one. States of being. This is more difficult. The verb to be. The verb to exist. The verb to seem. These are all states of being. For example, there is an apple, or there was an apple, or there will be an apple. It just tells us about the state of being. What if there were 2 apples? Then there are apples, there were apples, or there will be apples. It's just telling us that they are there, they are being. The idea that verbs express a state of being and not a physical action is something that you might struggle with at first, but actually these states of being verbs, called stative verbs, are very common, especially the verb to be, which is in fact the most common verb. Okay, let's bring back one of our physical action verbs. To wash. Let's call up some examples. John washes the dishes after dinner. When he was a boy, John washed the dishes after dinner. When he's older, John will wash the dishes after dinner. John is washing the dishes. John was washing the dishes when I first met him. John had washed the dishes before I arrived. Okay, all the text highlighted in orange are verbs from the verb to wash, but they're all different. We have 6 different versions, but actually there could be 12 different versions, and we're going to talk about that next. Every time you use a verb, there are some things you need to consider. For example, who or what is carrying out the action, or being. Remember, it can just be about being. When did the action occur? Is the action continuous or is it completed? And is the subject of the verb the doer or the receiver of the action? Okay, we're going to look at all of these in a little bit more detail. I just want to make the point that these are the things you need to know before you can choose your verb. So let's put up a sentence. John is washing the dishes. Once again, the highlighted text is our verb. So let's look at who or what. Well, that is John. And it's this word that tells us we need to use is. This is called the subject of the verb. Next, let's look at when. So it's happening now. John is washing the dishes now. And that's why we've had to use is. We could have used was and we could have used will be, but John is doing it now. And that's why we've used is. The when part of a verb is called tense. Okay, let's look at the next one. Is the action continuous or is it completed? Well, in this example, it's continuous, and that's why we've used washing. This is called the aspect of the verb. Again, we're going to cover this in a minute. And then the last one. Is the subject, we now know what that is, the doer or receiver of the action? And the answer to that question determines our sentence structure. And this is called voice. Now, I don't want to say doer or receiver. I want to call it active or passive. So, is the sentence active or passive? Is the subject doing the verb, in which case it's active? Or is something being done to the subject, in which case it's passive? And the answer to that question determines the sentence structure. And we will talk about that in a minute. Okay, we now know there are at least 4 things that determine what our verb looks like. Let's look at each one in a little more detail, starting with subject. The subject of every verb will fit into one of 6 categories. Here are the first 3. I, you, he, she and it, and then any singular nouns like dog, man or tree. Here are the next 3. We, you, and they, or any plural nouns like dogs, men, and trees. Every subject will fit in one of those 6 categories. The first 3 are the singular categories, and the second 3 are the plural categories. The top 3 are called first person singular, second person singular, and third person singular. The bottom 3 are called first person plural, second person plural, and third person plural. Every subject will fit into one of those 6 categories. And it's the category that determines what the verb looks like. Here is the verb to love in the present tense. As you can see, in the third one down, it changes. Here is the verb to be in the present tense. As you can see, they are all are apart from the top row and the third row. And here is the verb to have. As you can see, they are all have apart from the third row, the third person singular row. Now, as you learn more about subjects, you will learn that it's this third row that is the one that causes most change. And you might think that's a bit of a pain, but in other European languages, none of those words would be the same. They would all be different. There would be 6 changes in each of those verbs. And in English, most of the time, there's only 1. So it looks difficult, but actually it's easier than most other languages. Okay, that's all we're going to say about subject. We have a whole page on subjects on the website. Next, we're going to look at tense. Remember, tense tells us when something happened. So let's put a timeline up. Let's make this our now time. So this is the present. Okay, we have a picture of a plane because that's a plane from the present. This is a plane from the past, and this might be a rocket from the future. So this is our timeline. When an activity happens in the present, it is said to be in the present tense. For example, John washes the dishes. He's washing the dishes in the present. That is a verb in the present tense. What about if the activity took place in the past? We would have to say, John washed the dishes. Now our verb is in the past tense. And if he does it in the future, John will wash the dishes. Now our verb is in the future tense. It's worth saying that it doesn't have to be a long time in the past or the future. 1 second ago, 1 minute ago, 5 minutes ago, 100 years ago are all examples of the past. Same for the future. 1 minute's time, in a year's time, or in a decade's time are all times in the future. Next, we're going to cover aspect, and I'm going to leave the timeline up because aspect is part of tense. Remember, aspect is about whether the activity is continuous or completed. Let's start with one completed activity in the past. She flew her father's plane to her grandfather's farm. One activity completed in the past. That is called the simple aspect. So this is an example of the simple past tense. But let's not forget there would also be a simple present tense and a simple future tense. And that is true for all of the aspects we're going to cover. But we're just going to concentrate on the past tense just to understand the concept. Another use of the simple past tense is for habitual activities in the past. So she flew her father's plane after school. So it is a completed activity, but she may have done it more than once. Okay, next we have a completed activity before another activity took place. So she had flown her father's plane before her 11th birthday. This is an example of the perfect aspect. So this is a past perfect verb. Look at this one, an activity that was ongoing when another activity happened. She was flying the plane when the lightning started. Okay, this is an example of the continuous aspect. So the verb is in the past continuous tense. Next, we have an ongoing activity that ended before another activity took place. She had been flying the plane before we arrived. This is an example of the perfect continuous aspect. So the verb is in the past perfect continuous tense. This is quite a rare tense. Okay, we have a whole page on aspect, but just be aware when you're studying verbs, there are lots of important terms that are associated with verbs. So far we've done tense and aspect. Let's just put them up. So we have 4 aspects and 3 tenses. Let's look at our verb to wash again. There they are, 12. So there are 12 different versions of a verb. So you need to be prepared for that. Now is a good time to talk about the 5 verb forms. So there's the base form, which is wash. The S form, washes. The past form, washed. The ing form, washing. The past participle form, washed. And with these forms, you can create all 12 of the tenses that we've just seen. So, where's the base form? Well, the base form appears here. The base form is also called the infinitive form. You can see here that it's used after will, but it's also used after another type of verb called modal verbs, like can and might and should and could. And it's also the version you will find in the dictionary. And there are other uses of this base form as well, which are covered on the website. But looking at tenses, it only appears once. Next, we'll look at the S form. And in this grid, the S form is only used once, in the present tense. Next, the past form. and the past form is also only used once in this grid. Next, the ing form. The ing form is used 6 times. It's used in the continuous aspect and it's used in the perfect continuous aspect. And finally, the past participle form. And here it is, used in the perfect aspect. You will have spotted by now that the past participle form is the same as the past form. But that's only true for regular verbs. With irregular verbs, like to drink, for example, the past form and the past participle form are different. And learning the past form and the past participle form of irregular verbs is a very difficult part of English. Let's get rid of all of that. The last thing we're going to cover is voice. So let's go back to John. John washed the dishes. John is the subject of our verb. He is doing the action. So this is an active sentence. But this time, let's switch the focus onto the dishes. The dishes were washed by John. This time, the dishes is the subject of our sentence. But the dishes are not doing the action. The dishes are the receiver of the action. The action is being done to the dishes. This is a passive sentence. We have a whole page on voice and active and passive sentences. Okay, there was a lot of terminology there, and I want to leave you with this slide. Verbs express physical actions, mental actions, or states of being. And before you can choose your verb, you need to know who or what is carrying out the action. That's called the subject. You need to know when the action occurs. That'll give you the tense. You need to know whether that action is continuous or completed, and that'll give you the aspect. You need to know whether your sentence is active or passive, and that will give you the voice of your sentence and determine the sentence structure. And I should just warn you, there is another one called mood, but that only comes into play when we're talking about questions or orders. So remember this, every sentence must have a verb, and a verb expresses a physical action, a mental action, or a state of being. Thanks for watching.